I would like to take the moment to introduce Jason Yeatman. So Jason, he focuses on learning and the brain. He's a professor in both education and pediatrics at Stanford, and his lab studies how people learn to read, and he develops interventions for struggling readers. So Jason, thank you for presenting today on the cusp of summer, and take it away.
All right, it's really a pleasure to be here today. So my lab does research at the intersection of education and neuroscience. And one of the tenets of this talk is going to be that interdisciplinary work catalyzes discoveries that aren't possible within the confines of any specific discipline. So most of the research in my lab starts off looking like this: intervention studies or tests of different educational curriculum, usually in small groups of children. And as a neuroscientist, I see these education programs as a powerful tool to understand how experience shapes brain development. We can ask basic unanswered questions about how a child's experience in the world, how their experience interacting with educators, interacting with different curriculum, actually sculpts the development of specific brain circuits. Now, at the same time, we can use neuroscience, or our measurements of brain development in these children, as a tool where we hope to use these data to predict learning and personalize education. The broader idea is that having a better, deeper, more precise model of an individual's brain development and how they interact with their learning will help us personalize education to that individual's needs. So my lab focuses on reading, and for those of you that don't spend your days thinking about reading, I want to start off with a couple fundamental points. So the two people in this photo see fundamentally different things, and they will continue to for years. Well, I look at the page of this book and I can't help but hear the sounds of language that were written down by the author. My daughter just sees a series of pretty pictures here. And now, years later, even though she's walking and talking, able to communicate, she's 4 years old right now, she's very adept in oral language, but still written language is meaningless to her. So literacy was invented by modern societies. This means that our brains are not pre-wired for reading. No amount of books sitting in front of my daughter will awaken literacy within her. Instead, literacy is something that requires instruction. The neural circuitry of literacy is constructed in response to education, and therefore literacy depends on the brain's capacity for plasticity. A child's interactions with their parents, their early educators, literally sculpt the circuits that allow the brain to perform this incredible feat. Now, with this in mind, since the brain did not evolve specifically for literacy, it may come as no surprise that many children, as many as 10%, maybe more, struggle learning to read, and this is something we call dyslexia. So to illustrate this point here, I want to examine what's going on in my brain versus my daughter's brain as we stare at this book. So when our eyes move to the first image in this book, the picture of a rabbit, things start off in a roughly similar way. Images captured by our retina are sent to the back of our brain, our primary visual cortex, which starts analyzing the structure of this image. And signals move through our brain through a series of circuits along the base of our brain, coming from the back up to the front, that are involved in visual recognition, taking this image and recognizing rapidly that we're looking at a picture of a bunny rabbit. Now things are fundamentally different as soon as my eyes move to the text in this book. For my brain, a specific region that's involved in visual word recognition becomes active, and this immediately plugs into my spoken language circuitry, transforming this written language into a rich language representation that my brain can comprehend. For my daughter, instead, these language circuits don't become active until I start reading to her. Of course, I'm not just flipping through the pages, I'm reading out loud. And as soon as I start reading out loud, these spoken language circuits in my daughter's brain become active. Essentially, what you can think of the process of literacy as plugging the brain's visual system into its language circuitry in a new way, allowing visual signals to reach the circuits in our brain that evolved for communication. Now, one key thing in the brain to allow this to happen are the white matter connections, the bundles of wires that connect these circuits together. Two bundles of wires in particular. One known as the arcuate fasciculus, that's important for language skills. Another called the inferior longitudinal fasciculus that takes information from our visual cortex and shares it with the rest of the brain. The development of these white matter connections, these tracks that connect these circuits together, is critical for reading development. So a few key points to remember throughout this talk. First is that literacy prompts the development of specialized circuits in the visual cortex for rapid and automatic word recognition. Second, in the literate brain, written words are processed like spoken words. The brain's visual system is plugged into our language networks in a new way. Third, the structural connections, these bundles of wires that connect our visual system with our language circuits, are essential for reading. And finally, the development of the circuit goes awry in some children, and this is what we refer to as dyslexia. So based on this, we can ask the question, what is different about the dyslexic brain? And to summarize a wealth of research in one quick slide, well, one thing we know is that efficient communication between visual, auditory, and language regions is critical for skilled reading. And the white matter, or the bundles of wires that connect together these regions, are critically important for reading development. So what I'm showing in this slide here is a rendering of two white matter pathways, two connections between the brain's reading circuitry. And when I show renderings like this, I want you to think of an analogy to this image over here of a NASA supercomputer, where these bundles of wires allow information to be transferred between disparate brain circuits rapidly, allowing circuits to communicate to process complex information like written language. Now, when we examine children with dyslexia, we see subtle differences in the patterns of white matter connections, subtle differences in the way these tracks are structured in the child's brain. And this brings up the question of what are the implications of differences in the brain? When we measure differences between two children, how should we interpret them? And particularly, should we be thinking about this in terms of a stable trait, where differences in the brain are something that is just intrinsic to the child and can't be overcome? Or should we be thinking about these as terms of something that's plastic, that's malleable, that, for example, a child's interactions with their educators are actually going to shape and redefine the way these brain regions are structured? So to get at this question of can we influence brain development through a targeted intervention program, my lab recently ran a study where we brought in 34 children with dyslexia for an intensive reading intervention program. This was a program involved one-on-one training, so I bolded the word intensive because it's 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks, where children are working one-on-one with highly engaged, trained instructors who are working with them on the building blocks of literacy, segmenting and blending speech sounds together, building and deconstructing words with new letter combinations, working on sounding out new words, and constantly practicing building up reading fluency. So we find this intervention program improves reading skills over the course of 8 weeks of summer vacation. So this is showing behavioral data showing children's improvements over the course of the intervention program. There's 3 different measures of reading abilities here, one of reading accuracy, shown in orange, one of reading speed, shown in green, and one of reading fluency, shown in blue. This gray period here is a baseline period where we collected these measures over the course of the typical school year. Before children entered the intervention program, these measures were flat. They then enter the intervention, so you can see the intervention period here over 8 weeks, where they're coming into the lab every 2 weeks, and they show systematic growth in all these measures. So on average, children are going from about the 10th to about the 30th percentile. This is about 1 grade level or a little bit more change over the course of summer vacation. One other note is that we see variable growth. Some children show transformative change, showing 2 to 3 grade levels of improvement over the course of summer, where others show more limited growth. So now to a key question for my work, how do we measure brain connectivity? So we're going to use diffusion MRI. This is a non-invasive MRI measurement that indexes the flow of water through brain tissue. We're going to use this to understand how this learning program sculpts brain development. So to give you an analogy to understand how these measures index brain connections, I want you to think about the brain's white matter tracks, these connections between the brain, as pipes that carry water. So we're measuring the movement of water. And if you imagine that we create more insulation, better insulation around these pipes, that's going to mean less water diffusion. So measuring the rate of water diffusion in the brain gives us an indication of the level of insulation around these pipes, around these connections between brain regions. For those of you that prefer an analogy to computers, you can think of a decrease in water diffusion as indicating a higher bandwidth or denser packed connection between brain regions. Now, one of the beauties of these measures is a child lies in the scanner, and since it's a measure of the structure of the brain, not the activity of the brain, the child can watch their favorite movie. We've always found that Frozen tends to be the most popular one nowadays. So a child's lying in the scanner, we're measuring the structure of these brain connections, the data is coming off the scanner, my lab writes analysis pipelines that extract measures of diffusion for individual connections within each individual's brain. So let's look at one of those over the course of this intervention program. We'll look at the arcuate fasciculus, this key connection for the brain's reading circuitry. This is showing a measure of water diffusion in these children when they begin intervention. And then immediately within the first 2 weeks of intervention, after 50 hours of working with this instructor one-on-one, we already see a highly significant decrease in water diffusion, so indicating an increase in the density of tissue within this connection in the brain. This change continues and persists over the course of the intervention, and we don't see this type of change in our control group. So we see highly significant decrease in diffusion in our intervention group and no change in our control group. And this is an indication that this type of intervention program is changing the physical structure of the brain, changing the nature and density of connections between different brain regions, as opposed to just teaching a new strategy. The other thing we find is that these changes in brain connectivity track the learning process. So within each individual, we see the trajectory of plasticity in these white matter connections, tracking their growth and reading skills. And these findings motivate the question of whether we can engineer new MRI methods to monitor brain plasticity and learning. This is something that we're thinking about day to day, is how can we improve the nature of our measurements, and actually think about these non-invasive brain imaging technologies as a tool to measure plasticity and learning in the brain. So a couple takeaways. Reading difficulties are associated with differences in brain connectivity. Second, even in children with severe dyslexia, interventions are highly successful. Intensive interventions change the underlying wiring of the brain's reading circuitry. So this means that evidence-based education or intervention programs are literally sculpting brain development. Now, finally, we see that plasticity occurs in synchrony with the learning process, and this motivates us to constantly think about new methods to monitor brain plasticity and learning. This is something that's a current focus in my lab. So what's next? So I talked about using education as a tool to understand brain development, to understand how a child's experience shapes the development of brain circuits. Now we want to think about closing the circle and think about how we can use neuroscience as a tool to predict learning and personalized education. This is part of a broader mission referred to as precision education, capitalizing on a wealth of data to understand unique characteristics of an individual to be able to personalize learning to the unique needs of that individual. So how are we going about this? Well, we want to see if we can predict individual differences in learning and prescribe the optimal intervention for an individual. So showing how this might work. So this is showing data, a measurement of this same white matter pathway, the arcuate fasciculus, before children entered the intervention program. On this axis here is showing each individual's growth and reading skill, and this axis is showing a measurement of this individual's white matter structure. For this individual, we see incredible growth in reading over the course of the intervention. You can think of this, we found the perfect intervention for this individual. Whereas this individual showed relatively limited growth, meaning we need to pursue different approaches. So how we're going about this is we're making measurements before our interventions to characterize individual differences in the physical structure of brain circuits. We're then enrolling children in different intervention programs, and then collecting outcome measures to see if we can predict, based on these baseline biomarkers, differences in children's outcomes. So I'm going to end there. I want to thank, of course, all of our supporters at Stanford and elsewhere, and the folks in my lab who've conducted all this research. Thank you.
That was great. Jason, a quick question. So I'm a new parent. I have a 2-year-old. They're not reading yet. I'm really worried they might have dyslexia. Should I take them to your lab to get a scan to see if you can predict whether they're going to need special intervention?
You know, so what I always say is that, first of all, if you have a 2-year-old, you shouldn't be worrying about that yet. The most important thing we can do is think about literacy in the context of development. Think of the different milestones we want to be thinking about at each stage. And one of the most important things for young children is just the language environment around them. Having books around, having caregivers or parents that engage with them, create a rich language environment. And then thinking about the different milestones that lay the foundation for literacy. We shouldn't be thinking about teaching a 2-year-old to read. We should be thinking about making sure that 2-year-old is in a rich language environment, allowing them to develop the necessary foundations for literacies. So Dan, don't worry about getting your 2-year-old into an intervention program yet.
Okay, thank you. I feel better, Jason. Next, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jo Boaler. Jo Boaler is the Nomellini and Olivier Professor of Education, and she focuses on how to teach math, as I'm sure many of you know. She's well known among educators and teachers and scholars for research an application of growth mindset in mathematics. And she's partnered with neuroscientists to study how different teaching methods in mathematics can affect learning and what happens in your brain when you learn in different ways. So Jo, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So I am not a neuroscientist, but I've been really inspired by the work in neuroscience, and I have been working for the last several years to get some of the most important ideas out to teachers. As we probably know, teachers don't have time and usually access to read research articles. So we share a lot of this information on YouCubed. Jason's really important work is on there, as are other neuroscientists. And what's been great is we have translated some of these ideas into lessons for teachers and videos for learners. And yeah, we've been very happy with the uptake. So the first idea that we share with teachers, this may seem obvious to a lot of people listening, but is the neuroplasticity that Jason has been talking about. Unfortunately, many people have the opposite view that you're either born with a math brain or you're not. Students believe that idea, teachers believe it. Schooling structures have really been developed around those fixed ideas. So this is not how it works, although this is what many people believe. And students, when they start to struggle in a maths classroom, often start to think, I don't have the right kind of brain. That student over there has the maths brain and I don't. So we encourage teachers to share with their students what neuroscientists have shared with me, which is that every time we learn, these connections are happening in our brain. We could be forming a new brain pathway. We could be connecting brain pathways or strengthening pathways. And these pathways are developing all the time. This is the essence of neuroplasticity. Some of the very first work that was done that discovered the plasticity of the brain was actually in my hometown of London, where they decided to focus on London black cab drivers. Turns out, to become a black cab driver, you have to know 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks in central London and all the connections between them. So after going through this intense spatial training, neuroscientists studied the brains of the cab drivers and found that at the end of this training period, their hippocampus had developed and grown. Also that when they retired from being cab drivers, that area of the brain shrunk back down, not because they were getting older, but just because they weren't using that area of the brain as much. I also like to share stories of people. This is somebody called Nicholaslechford, who grew up in Australia, and in first grade, his parents were told he was learning disabled. He had a very low IQ. The parents were told he was the worst child they'd seen in the school for 20 years. Terrible messages. But his mother decided to really take on these labels. I'm pleased to tell you that Nicholas graduated from Oxford with a doctorate in applied mathematics a couple of years ago. You can't really get higher achievement than that. So we know now that with the right messages, with the right educational work, that all students, even those with special educational needs, can change their brains. So that's the first evidence I really emphasize with teachers. The other that I think is really important is just the importance of the times for our brain when we're struggling, when we're making mistakes. These turn out to be really good times for the brain. There's some of the first evidence of this came from Jason Moser and his colleagues, who found that when they were studying people's brains that there was actually synapses were firing, activity was happening when people were making mistakes. And neuroscientists have shared with me that if you're not struggling, you're not learning. It's really critical that you engage your brain in that kind of struggle. We find when we share this message with learners, it's freeing. It will cause them to keep going for longer, to persist. When I teach maths and people look at me and say, oh, this is so hard, I say to them, that's fantastic. That feeling of it being so hard, it feels like that because your brain is working so hard. And this message of embracing struggle is one that changes not just learners, but adults. They're more willing to share times of uncertainty. We do, as well as work with teachers, every so often we have summer camps at Stanford where we bring in students. One of our camps a couple of years ago, we brought in middle school students. And after 4 weeks of sharing these messages and teaching maths differently, they improved at a rate that was equivalent to 2.8 years of school. So it was pretty phenomenal. And when I was learning about this research on struggle, I really thought back to this particular student, Isabella, who was the student who really seemed to be struggling the most, who was often willing to share her thinking even when it was wrong, and was what people talk about being right at the edge of her understanding. So I looked back at our data and found that she actually improved more than any student in the whole camp. And she was, as I said, at this place of being at the edge of her understanding, which we know is a really important place to be. So that message of struggle is extremely important one. I'm very fortunate to work with great teachers who have taken on these messages. And I wanted to share with you, this is one of them. Jen Schaefer is a 5th grade teacher in Canada. And she shares these messages in different ways. She has this image on Post-it notes all through her room. And she says to the kids, you've got to get on the steps of struggle. You don't need to be that cocky kid on the top step, but you don't want to be the one on the bottom step. These steps are really important. And she said the kids really like this metaphor. There's one they like even more. It's called the learning pit, or getting into that pit of struggle. This is an image that her 5th grade students made together. And you can see as they're going down into the pit, they're saying things like, I'm not good at maths, I'm confused. But as they're coming out, they're saying, I'm just going to get some tools and work harder. And I loved that when I interviewed Jen, she said that her students come to her and they say, Miss Schaefer, I'm really in the pit. And her response to that is, excellent. What classroom tools do you need? And there's a couple of important things about that response. One, she values them being in the pit. The other, she doesn't jump in and make the work easier for them. She asks them what tools will help them. And I think as teachers, we have all been trained to save students from struggle, to make the work more structured, to empty it of that struggle. And that's something we should rethink. And then another area of neuroscience that is amazing comes from another neuroscientist at Stanford, Vinod Menon, and his group have shown that when we think about something mathematical, there's actually 5 different brain pathways that are activated. And it's really important not only that we activate these different pathways, but that we connect pathways. And we know in mathematics, there are lots of ways to think mathematically. And when we think, for example, with numbers, but also with words, with pictures, with graphs or algorithms or tables, when we build things or move with mathematics, that's going to enable these great brain connections that are so important. A lot of this neuroscience leads into the amazing work of Carol Dweck and her knowledge that, what you believe about yourself actually will change what you can do. If you believe that struggle is good and that your brain is growing, that will actually change your learning. We have evidence that's extensive on what happens when you change your mindset, improving learning, decreasing aggression. But I have found over the last years since mindset ideas have been released that a lot of teachers have jumped on this mindset bus or bandwagon. They're sharing ideas that, you've just got to work hard. But when those ideas hit the wall of what I think of as fixed mathematics, those ideas fall flat. And what I mean by fixed mathematics is questions with one answer, with one method, where kids don't see how they can grow and learn. So at UCubed, we do a lot of work to change mathematics to be one that has space inside it for learning, where there are opportunities for brain connections by seeing maths visually. And so I wanted to show you a couple of examples of this. And my first example comes from fractions. This is like the bane of many kids' lives, division of fractions, teachers as well. So you can ask this question in a totally fixed way. What is 1 divided by 2/3? Kids get stressed, they try and do a calculation. Or great teachers like Kathy Humphries starts with, you may know a rule for this, but I don't care about the rule today. I want you to make sense of this answer visually and prove it to me with visuals. So here, suddenly this question changes dramatically from one that's a calculation to one that has these opportunities for growth, for brain connections. Let's think about another one. Rectangles. We can really change all maths questions. You can ask kids, what's the area of an 8x3 rectangle? And their task is to calculate. It has one answer, probably one method. Or you can ask kids, what rectangles have an area of 24? Think about that. Now they're having to think about the relationship between length and width. There are lots of different answers to think about. They can visualize. So we can really do this with all mathematics. If I were to ask you now, which I will ask you, to think about the answer to 18 times 5 number problem, to think about that in your head without writing anything down. I'm not going to, I'm sorry, give you time to really think about this, but I will share that when I ask lots of people this question, the first method that many people use is to, in their head, think of that traditional algorithm, line it up, carry the numbers. Actually not the easiest thing to think about when you're doing it mentally, which is fine. This is one method, but we can also think about 18 times 5 in different ways. People with number flexibility are able to think about 20 times 5 and take off 2 5s, or maybe 10 times 5 and 8 times 5, or 9 times 5s, or 18s, or one of my favorites, 18 times 5 is actually the same as 9 times 10. And that visual really shows why that is the case. So you may be thinking to yourself, okay, we can open up these maths problems. What about things like algebra? Has to be really procedural. So one of my favorite problems that I like to share is to ask people. So this is a pattern that's often used in maths class, and kids are asked, how many squares are in the nth case? And the expectation in maths class is that kids will count the squares and stare at this table of numbers until they notice that there's a relationship between the case number and the total number of squares. And that relationship is that you add one and square to get the total number. We have just changed this question slightly by asking kids, how do you see the growth? And what happens is students will see how this shape grows in all sorts of different ways. Not only do they see it in different ways, but that visual growth allows them to understand the function that describes this algebraically. It does grow as an n+1 squared function. And we see, if you look at that method on the bottom right-hand corner, exactly why. It's a square function. So I think we've done a great disservice in mathematics by making it all about numbers without visuals, without opening up problems. And one other area of neuroscience that's just so incredible comes also from the labs at Stanford and other places, finding out that fingers are so important to mathematics. When you increase your finger perception, your maths achievement goes up, which is really amazing. This has led, Jason talked about the value of interdisciplinary projects, to a study that we've been involved in the last year or so, educators, engineers, neuroscientists, actually making small robotic devices where kids interact with mathematics through their fingers, feeling their finger reaction. Really amazing results. So before I leave you, I just wanted to share that when teachers take on these messages from neuroscience, when they make mathematics more multidimensional, when they're sharing the value of struggle and the value, you know, the fact that our brains are changing all the time, amazing things happen. One middle school teacher attended one of our workshops, went back and changed the way he was teaching maths. And inside that year, his 8th grade class, which he was getting 6% proficiency rates, went up to 70%. So we know this is highly effective. We've studied it as well with hundreds of teachers. This study on the right was one we did in the Central Valley, where teachers took my online class and went and changed their teaching. And even inside that year, we got significant increases from students on standardized tests. So if you would like to read more or find out more about this, these are some books that share these ideas. Here are some online classes that share these ideas. The one on the left is the one that the teachers took in the Central Valley. And I do encourage you to come to UCubed. You'll be hearing about data initiatives in a little while. One of our recent initiatives is to share data lessons, K-12, and a new high school course. So thank you for listening. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Do come to UCubed if you would like to see more.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. So now we're going to switch to questions. And there's a number of very good questions. Some of them are not about the learning sciences. They're about technology. So I may save them for the session when we talk about technologies. Let me kick it off real quickly. This is both for Joe and Jason. When I think of the brain, I actually think of a very competitive environment. Different parts are trying to grow sort of at the expense of other parts, right? So like if I cover a young cat's eye for some period of time, the neurons associated with that eye will suddenly start to be taken over by the other eye. So the question is, with all these interventions where you're showing tremendous responsiveness and learning, are the students paying a price somewhere else? Is there some side effect? Like if I do too much math, I'll stop being able to read. Or if I do too much reading, I'll stop being able to smell the flowers.
That's a great question. Maybe I'll jump in and then pass it off to Joe if she wants to add something in. At one level, that's most certainly true. You think of some of the most basic phenomena in the brain, like ocular dominance columns, what was referred to there, of the eyes competing for a cortical territory. And those ideas have been a major foundation in theories about brain development and learning. So the idea that reading competes with other visual functions for territory in the cortex. But there has yet to be any data showing that learning to read, for example, makes you lose anything. We have yet to see, there's theories suggesting that maybe you would, but there's been no data yet showing any function that gets worse. And when you step back and think about, these training programs, it's not just training in literacy, it's training in a way to think, in a way to create new connections between vision and language. You think about the math programs Joe was talking about, and it's not just rote memorization of a series of equations, right? You're teaching children how to think in an abstract way. So in many ways, these training programs that are designed to, or educational programs that are designed to focus on one skill actually end up being much broader learning programs where, in our interventions, which target dyslexia, but children also learn how to learn in a different way. And that's a big focus of the way we go about structuring these training programs. It's not just cramming in more knowledge, but learning about how to learn and how to capitalize on their own skills to improve their reading abilities. I know, Joe, did you want to add anything else?
I would just say that, to echo what you just said, Jason, we have an online class for students. And we actually find that when students take this class, which shares about maths and the brain, they do significantly better in maths, but also in reading, in English, in science. So I think that we know that there is competitive brain space, but similarly, we don't know of anyone who sort of improves mathematically and then goes down in other areas. So I don't think we need to worry too much about that.
So let me chase this question one more time. So my sister is a biologist, and she explained to me why kangaroos have short arms, okay? And the reason they have short arms is their fingers grow very long early on so they can climb into the pouch or climb out of the pouch. And the way the growth goes is if the extremities grow, that's the signal for everything else to shut down growing once they reach maturity. So I want my kid to read at the age of 3, and I want them to be doing algebra at the age of 4. Is this a bad idea?
I think all of these things occur in a developmental context, right? That you think about, what do you need to do to read? Well, you need incredible high acuity vision. You need a visual system that can rapidly recognize complex patterns. And this depends on, a sequence of developmental events in the visual system that allows the visual system to encode information in a way to allow these incredible visual processes. You need the same thing with language. You need a deep understanding of the sound structure of language. These all have their own developmental time courses. So the idea of taking a brain that hasn't, yet achieved a sequence of kind of basic milestones and then trying to slot something really complicated in earlier just doesn't really make sense. I mean, work on the precursors. With my daughter, you said there's a lot of research in literacy. What can you do in young kids? Well, work on helping them understand that language can be decomposed into sounds. When they can understand that the word Stanford starts with the sound S, it's going to be a lot easier for them to understand that now there's a visual symbol that you can assign to the sound S. So there's a series of precursors that lead to literacy skills, similarly for math, that you don't want to subvert this developmental process.
Yeah, and I would say from an educational standpoint, there's a lot of danger to thinking I've got to early on get my kids to learn this maths or English and get them ahead of others, because it's led to this whole thinking in education of racing kids through and thinking that somebody isn't at that level, then maybe we give up on them, even though they're 7, when next year they may have flourished and done amazing things. So I think thinking in this linear way of pushing kids through and trying to get it as high, as fast as possible is not so productive.
Very good. So one of the comments made the nice point that people who learn 2 languages, they're in dual language households, they actually learn both languages just fine, and it helps them with things like attention, switching attention. So evidently we are infinite, Joe.
It's true. And I know being bilingual brings a lot of benefits.
Yeah. So there's a question about, do any of these targeted kinds of interventions where you're really working hard, does it work for adults as well? We know, like, Jason, is there a sort of a window for working on reading skills?
Yeah, I'll give 2 different answers to that question that you can think about. They're actually not contradictory. So one is, these interventions tend to be more effective earlier on for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is if you're struggling early on, the struggles just compound. If you get to 3rd grade and 4th grade where you're being given books to go home and read and you still can't read them, you're just falling behind in everything. So from the public health standpoint, an economic standpoint, and well-being of the child standpoint, children that are struggling early on, we really want to make sure they get the support they need early on. There's a wealth of data showing that early interventions are more effective. Now, that's not to say that past a certain age they're not effective. And even into adulthood, so the same interventions that we're using in early elementary school have been studied in adulthood and have similar effect sizes. Now, the downside is when you take most adults, by the time they're adults, if they're still struggling with reading, they've found ways to compensate, and they often don't have 8 weeks to take off and focus on their reading skills. But if they did, these interventions are still quite effective. That being said, we'd be better off doing it earlier on.
So, Joe?
Yeah, I think we see lots of evidence. The London cab driver study is part of that adults can also undergo significant brain change. They do some of the studies with adults in retirement homes and see that when they take on new types of activities, it causes the greatest brain growth. So I think this is really good news for us as adults.
So there is hope that I could get an A in calculus. Okay, that was great. We're going to have to bring this to a close. I want to thank you both very, very much, Jason and Joe. It's always great to hear from you, and it's big ideas, and I love it.